Today we're going to read between the lines of the campaign promises of the two political parties, the two major political parties, and we're going to stack them up against the economic reality that the Bahamas faces today. This is a time where emotions will run high and your choices are easily influenced by your political side. But it's important for us to have these types of discussions, to pause, be measured, and analyze the facts without bias. So this not only makes you a more informed voter, but it makes you a little bit more confident going to the polls on May 12th. And you're able to distinguish between what's being sold to you and what the economic reality is. So that's why we're holding this webinar, because it doesn't matter where you fall on the political spectrum, there's value in understanding what's being offered to you in exchange for your precious vote. So this morning, we're inviting you to put party loyalty aside as we explore simple but critical questions. When politicians make promises to you this election season, how will those promises affect your grocery and electricity bills? How will those promises affect your ability to invest in real estate or a new business? And how will they affect your job prospects and ultimately your future and the future of thousands of Bahamians who will come after you? So with that, I welcome you to the first Coffee Break webinar of 2026. We took a little bit of a break last year, but we're back and we're happy to continue our mission of educating the public on fiscal and financial concepts and economic topics that we believe are important for everyone to know. So now I'm happy to introduce our panel of very knowledgeable experts, not just because they are finance professionals, but because, like you, they are voters, and they will be heading to the poll and voting based on their knowledge on May 12th. So first, I'd like to introduce Lachelle White. She is a CFA and has been with our company for 17 years. Welcome, Lachelle.
Thank you. Good morning.
Next, we have Pamela Ferguson, our Vice President of Investments. I'm sorry, Lachelle is our Manager of Investments. Next, we have Pamela Ferguson, who is the Vice President of Investments, and she has been with CFAL for about 28 years, almost 30 years. Yeah. Wonderful.
Good to be here. Good morning.
And we also have our newly promoted Manager of Trading, Anna Zerbos. Anna has been with us also for 17 years. Welcome, Anna.
Good morning.
And we have Angelo Butler now, AKA the Professor. He's our Manager of Corporate Advisory Services. And Angelo has been with us for about a decade now. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. And we hope that this is a very lively but fair discussion about the matters before us. So let's jump right into everything. Let's start off by hearing from each of you what you believe is the single most pressing economic issue facing the Bahamas right now. You go ahead, Lachelle.
Well, for me, I think that the most pressing issue is housing affordability for all Bahamians. So we've seen over the past few years, the past decade or so, that affordability is worsening. And rents have gone up, home prices have gone up faster than earnings have gone up. So what we see is persons having to put a larger chunk of their income into housing, and that gives them less monies to spend in other areas, less money to save, and less money to invest. And also for young professionals, they're unable to join the housing market and unable to start building wealth. And you would hear stories about people 20, 30 years ago who talk about they were able to get a piece of land and they were able to build their house out of pocket. And they were able to just sort of start building wealth, but we don't hear about that today. So what we are seeing now is that people can't get access to credit. The latest figures I saw were mortgage approvals were just about 54%. I think that was in 2024. So about half the persons that are applying for mortgages are not receiving them. And we see that this is an issue not just unique to the Bahamas, but all over the world. You hear about housing prices in the US sort of skyrocketing, and persons are not able to afford their homes. And even people who can afford the home just owning a home itself is just expensive. So this is not a social issue, but this is an economic issue. And I feel as if while successive governments have focused on it, what is being done is just not enough to cure this problem long term.
How about you?
It's for me, it's economic equity. Economic equity, what I want to see is for the growth that the country experienced to be translated into economic benefits and opportunities for more Bahamian. When we look at our growth rate over the past, let's say 15, 20 years, it's been flat rate. 1%, a little bit, maybe above 1%. And I thought about it, we have successive administrations would announce projects, hundreds of millions of dollars in projects, and the economic impact, as well as the employment that these projects will attract. But when you look back, if you were to take the growth rate for those announcements, you see that they're not panning out because our growth rate is relatively low. So what I want to see is when the economy grows, more people benefit. Over the last 2 years, we've had on average growth of 3%. It's good. Considering for the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've had just average growth. Now, I'm backing out the effects of Dorian in 2019, as well as the pandemic from 2020 to, let's say, 2023. So I believe growth is happening, but the question is, who is participating in this growth? And the factors that drove the growth over the last 2 years is tourism arrival numbers. When I looked at the numbers, I think last year we had about 12 plus million tourists that came to our shores, and that's awesome. But when you drill further, you see that our stopover, which is the more lucrative tourism market, has been contracting, and the cruise ship tourist has been expanding, and that's good. And they both have a role to play. But the reason why stopover is so important is because they spend more money, and more money is trickled into the economy. But we are using tourism visitor numbers to drive this growth. And with all the growth in tourism, while unemployment is single digit, youth unemployment, which is the ages 16 to 24, is 20%. There's a disconnect. There's a mismatch. So what I want is for there to be more focus on economic equity so that when our country experiences growth, that is translated so that more Bahamians can benefit. Infrastructure development and upward mobility for more Bahamians.
Those are really good. How about you?
Issues that we face in the Bahamas right now, and not just any jobs that are stable, meaningful, and built for the future. According to the Department of Statistics, unemployment is currently around 9.3%, which is a decline from the previous number of 10.8%. But that number doesn't tell the full story. Like Pam just said, youth unemployment is over 20%. So that's more than double the national rate. And each year we're seeing thousands of young Bahamians enter the workforce. And they're not just competing with each other, but they're competing with individuals who are already underemployed or working multiple jobs just to have, their ends meet. The reality is much of the Bahamas employment growth rate remains concentrated in low-wage jobs, like Pam said, in the tourism industry, with very limited upward mobility. So there's not much room for growth for them. So these jobs may improve the headline numbers, but they don't allow families to save consistently, to buy a home, plan for retirement, or to keep pace with the rising cost of living. A job that cannot support a household is not economic progress. That's just survival.
I think for me, it's, the cost of living, primarily inflation. Typically, around the world, they try to keep inflation at around 2%, per year, right? And since COVID, there was a significant spike, in inflation. You know, central banks around the world did measures. They had to restrict the economy a bit to try and get that down. And then we had like tariffs, for example, right? So prices then went up again. And of course, when prices go up, they never really come back down, right? So it just becomes a new level, which inflation is then calculated on. And, now we have the Iranian war where oil prices are near $100 per barrel. So it just seems like one thing after the next. In school, they said that inflation was good, but I don't necessarily believe that, right? I think it's difficult for us to accept that prices will go up every year for the rest of our lives, and wages do not keep up. So it's been difficult, and I think the cost of living is just running away from what persons can realistically keep up. And like Pam mentioned, our economy grows at 3%, right? But if inflation is 2%, you're just barely scraping the surface of keeping up. And I think that's the biggest issue. And it's not just a Bahamas issue, it's a global issue. And you're seeing people adjust their habits, significantly to try and keep up with the cost of living.
Well, uh, regards- But now this is a good time for me to go ahead and kind of break down what we're seeing from the two major parties. So in terms of taxation and the cost of living, both parties are promising relief at the checkpoint. The PLP has already moved back from unprepared foods at the food store as of April 1st, and they're now proposing competition law to crack down on price fixing. The FNM is going a little bit further, and they want zero VAT on not just food, but on all everyday essentials, medical costs, and educational supplies. That's a broader promise and also an expensive one. But both are also proposing consumer protection measures. But the FNM is adding a little bit more of a specific comment to bank fee transparency and faster account keeping when it comes to opening up banks. On the housing matter, the headline difference here is scale and mechanism. The PLP is expanding its existing rent-to-own program, prioritizing essential workers like nurses and teachers. And they also want to implement a residential tenancy authority to enforce housing standards. They want to do away with outdoor toilets, etc. The FNM is also promising to build at least 5,000 new home units through public-private partnerships, wanting to reduce the down payments requirements for first-time buyers. And they're also proposing a real estate investment trust to mobilize private capital for large-scale development. Both parties have acknowledged the need for housing and the housing shortage on the Family Islands and are proposing new subdivisions on Abaco, Eleuthera, and Exuma. Regarding the workforce, the PLP centerpiece here is the Employment Bill 2026. And that's going to be, if enacted, a very significant law reform, the most done in a generation. It includes capped probation periods, a guaranteed rest break between shifts, 3 mental wellness days per year, and notably 2 weeks of paid paternity leave for men. And that's going to be the first in Bahamian history. Maternity leave would also rise from 12 to 14 weeks. On the other side, the FNM's labor commitments are a little less legislative and more financial. They have proposed a $200 monthly child support payment for the first 2 years of the child's life, as well as $100 weekly stipend for young people in training. And also they're proposing to increase the maternity grant by 50%. On the business development fronts and investment front. Cutting the red tape, the PLP is betting on its My Gateway platform to streamline the process of business, I guess the business red tape. You'll have one application to register a business, get a license, and enroll with NIE. The FNM is countering with a taxpayer charter, setting service standards at a $10 million annual grant to small and micro businesses and a dedicated commercial court to resolve business disputes a little faster. They're also proposing new industries. The Progressive Liberal Party has proposed a National AI Commission and an AI Governance Act. And the Free National Movement has proposed the implementation of a national lottery that has garnered a lot of attention recently. And then finally, when it comes to fiscal management, both parties are targeting the same debt goal, bringing the debt to GDP ratio down to about 50%. The PLP says it's already secured the first credit upgrade in nearly 20 years and wants to maintain that trajectory without raising that. And the FNM wants to go a step further institutionally by proposing a fiscal rule that would require the government to run a balanced budget under normal circumstances. That's a mouthful.
Yeah.
But I wanted to kind of break down exactly what we're talking about, and we can compare and see what is being proposed and if it is realistic. And so I'll go ahead and I'll put this first question to you. Let's go, Angelo. Can you first of all walk us through the current fiscal situation that the Bahamas has and that the government, whoever wins in May, will face when they take office?
So the Bahamas debt today is around 12 billion public debt, and that's about 80% of GDP. I do give the government credit because like they would promote when they came into office, and for various reasons the debt to GDP was around 100%. So they have done a good job in reopening the economy, slowing the rate of growth in the debt, and unfortunately we still run fiscal deficits. However, the debt is still growing and the interest payments are probably the largest line item in the budget. So, the government does have fiscal room, but at the same time, we have to, I think we need more fiscal discipline. During the election cycle, all the manifestos speak about is expenditure, right? You don't hear anything really about the revenue side and how you'll pay for a lot of it. And rightfully so, no one wants to hear, I don't want to say bad news, but the prospect of more taxation. I think we just have to understand that a government that's running a deficit cannot give us anything free, right? There's a cost. It's either additional borrowing or it must come from taxation. So while we're not on the brink of bankruptcy or anything like that, we do have some fiscal strain and we still have to be prudent in what we promise and what we can deliver.
Promises. I think it is important for us as the voter to understand from our candidates and the political organizations how they propose to structure as well as fund a lot of the promises. A lot of times that's not important. People are concerned and they're hyped about their political organization or a lot of the memes and a lot of the excitement. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you drill down, understanding that will help you determine if they're going to fulfill that promise first and also how they are proposed to do it. So and what I feel that there's convergence with a lot of the promises. You mentioned those. They both have, both of the major political organizations have a strategy or a promise or a plan for what they want to do. So let's take VAT, for instance. You mentioned how the incumbent has removed VAT off of uncooked foods in the food store. And that's good. Any type of relief is good. So we're looking for any type of relief. But remember I said structure and how you're going to fund it. So what they did was make that VAT tax exempted. And what that means is the owner of the store, the grocer, when they go at the port of entry, they have to pay VAT. But when they sell it to us, there's not a line item for that VAT. And so that's a cost to the business. I'm gonna get there. No, I'm gonna get there. No, I'm gonna get there. I'm showing the difference. There's a cost to the business. What do you think that business is gonna do with that cost over time? They're gonna pass it on to us. So, and I get it from the government perspective in that we're in a tight fiscal space. So the government is saying, I want to try to hold on to as much of my revenue as possible. So they don't lose. They continue to get their revenue. But in terms of prices at the register, you won't have that line item that says VAT, but that cost will most probably be factored into that price, and you see little reduction in price. The Free National Movement, on the other hand, says we're going to remove VAT from all essential items, I guess the bread basket, basically resetting it back to what it was prior to 2021, but it's going to be zero rated. And zero rate means that at the port, there's no VAT, as well as at the register, there's no VAT. So you may see a reduction in your goods, but who is going to pay? How are you going to fund that loss in revenue?
Yeah, and are we in the position fiscally? This goes to my next question. Are these policies like that even realistic, given our fiscal position?
Yeah, most of these policies are focused on reducing cost for Bahamians, and that means removal of taxes. But we need something to offset, like Pam alluded to offset the removal of those taxes. And so what we need faster economic growth to offset that, or we need to know, are the politicians going to increase taxes elsewhere, or are they going to cut spending in other areas to offset this loss in revenues? And Angelo mentioned that, all of these things are focused on the expenditure side, but we don't see like what revenue is coming in to offset that. And both parties, as you mentioned, are talking about the balanced budget. How are we going to balance the budget if you're only showing us one side of the picture? Yeah. And then also, as I always want to say, we don't have any political debates, so we can't hold them accountable. We can't get clarification on these matters. So I think that this is why you have to have these conversations, and you have to confront them about how these things are going to work and who is going to pay the ultimate bill.
And I'm glad you made that point, because it's so important for us to take control of our education, because they're going to say anything. And we need to be able to look at what's being said, go home, read up on it, research it. Just don't let anybody say anything to you. You need to be well informed, and that's why we're having this webinar today. So when we talk about these things, we talk about fiscal discipline. And we've seen over the past few decades, we've seen kind of this back and forth where policies are implemented for 5 years, and then it's stopped, canceled, reviewed, or paused, and back and forth. How important is fiscal discipline over a long period of time, over a long stretch of time?
It's very important, Paige. Fiscal discipline is the government's ability to manage its resources responsibly, spend below your means. And I know we don't normally hear that as it relates to government, because there's this thought that there's an unlimited resources, and if the government runs low, they just tax people, right? And also to borrow carefully and to keep debt sustainably. Spending is very important, because when government cannot control its spending, it has to make up. It has to close that gap. It can do it by increasing taxes. And we know if you overburden people with taxes, you constrain growth. We could do it by borrowing, which is what we have been doing. Angelo mentioned to the tune of 12.7, I think, billion dollars. And while we may have some wiggle room relative to the pandemic years, really, a country like the Bahamas is supposed to have a debt to GDP ratio of about 40 to 60%. And we are 75 or so percent. So we are really handcuffing ourselves because of the lack of fiscal discipline over the years. And then when you look at it, the debt is high and growing. And one of the main reasons why Michelle mentioned it, there's lack of growth. I mean, growth where you could put money aside to pay down debt, not that type of growth, not that growth where, we have a lot of these foreign projects and you're using that to say growth would be spurred, because we see that the rates they're not adding up. They're not matching the announcements made with these projects. But one of the key issues is our interest burden. We are at at the end of December, $672 million. That's at the end of December. That's not for so far for the year. That's at the end of December. I mean, think about that. I think we spend about 300 plus million in education or 300 plus million in healthcare. Think about that. All of that money that can be used, right? That is years of spending beyond our means. And so fiscal discipline is very, very important.
I want to just interject and say we have some initial numbers from our poll. And the first question was asking our attendees today, what do you think the most important economic issue is facing the Bahamas? And 64% of you have said the cost of living. Just like me, I feel the same. If we all shop at the same store and we see the prices going up, and I don't know if you guys get the frantic text, go and fill up your car before gas prices rise again at midnight. Second to that, people are very concerned about affordable housing, and then economic equity is also a very important thing. I want to also talk a little bit about what they say. Our poll also asks, what area do you think requires the most government spending right now? And given the cost of things and the services that were required, the answer was healthcare. 72% say healthcare is the most needed expenditure right now that we need in the country. So when we talk about government spending and how they spend, how realistic is it for them to address these issues that Bahamians have pegged against how much money is coming in?
Yeah, so I feel that there are some promises that require long-term planning and a long-term vision. And you mentioned the poll, everybody said healthcare. And we've heard all of these horror stories about what's going on with the hospital. And these things they didn't just happen overnight, and they're not going to just be fixed overnight. Investment in healthcare infrastructure is long-term. So this is going to take 10, 20 years to get us where we need to be, even though in the short term, you can make adjustments to make sure that things are better. We don't have a lot of fiscal room, so we have to be targeted and intentional about the spending that we do in these areas. But to me, it's always been there are three pillars of the economy, and that has been healthcare, education, and national security. And as Pam mentioned, these are the three things that we spend the most money on, but that's after we pay interest to service our debt. So it all comes full circle. We're spending all this money to service our debt, and we can't spend this money in the needed areas to strengthen our economy.
I want to ask, so looking at the political platforms, the campaign platforms of the major parties, are they focused on long-term growth that can address these issues over the long term? You mentioned that addressing these matters are a 10, 15, 20-year kind of process. Are they targeting long-term growth, or is there just short-term appeal, giving people the things they need today to feel comfortable versus planning for our future as a country?
I think it's a mixture, because the cost of living crisis, there's some countries around the world that call it a crisis, and I believe it's probably a crisis here as well. That's immediate. You want relief right now, and you have issues like a balanced budget. That's more long-term. Healthcare, education, that's more long-term. But I feel like they have in their promises, they have addressed the short and the long term. But the question is, where are you going to get the money to do a lot of the things that you want to do because of our fragile fiscal position?
I agree with Pam. Both platforms are focused on both short-term and long-term, but they need to find a balance. Balance is what really matters. No platform can afford to be purely long-term because a lot of people need relief right now. And election cycles naturally reward short-term results, but because voters are dealing with rising costs of living and unemployment, so it's expected and politically effective that platforms emphasize immediate relief. In contrast, though, long-term growth requires structural change and are harder to campaign on because, their benefits are less visible. It takes a longer time for them to actually implement these long-term goals, and there's often immediate upfront costs to do so. So the strongest economic platforms are the ones that connect immediate relief to long-term productivity. At the end of the day, short-term appeal may win elections, but long-term growth is what we need to sustain our economy.
I think like you said, it's, your 5 years, I think we are a victim of our political system. While it's good that you have the ability to, as we've done in the past 5 elections, get rid of the government, it also hinders the consistency of policy, right? And like Anna mentioned, you can't go on a campaign trail and tell someone I can do something that can benefit you in 10 years when they don't know how they're gonna afford, to keep up with the cost of living. So it is a challenge and something that must be considered. But again, I always say that the short-term approach we've tried over the last 5 elections has not worked, right? Because you do these short-term things and then you still don't win the election. So I think, we should start to think a bit more long-term, for the benefit of the future.
I imagine it's incredibly difficult for particularly people who are living paycheck to paycheck and they want to hear from their MP or their party, what you going to give me everywhere I go, what's in it for me? But we've been talking for a very, very long time, for as long as I can remember, about this national development plan, this decades-long plan to get us to where we can be. I know, Pam, you've spoken before about how our debt to GDP really should be around that or lower than 50%. How important is it for us to look beyond these 5-year cycles? Because we're very indisciplined people, we're very indisciplined voters. We change back and forth. I mean, sometimes you never know what's going to happen this time, but we're always changing whatever our motive is from election cycle to election cycle. How important is it for us to look beyond the 5 years?
I don't have a problem with that. A lot of people say, this 5-year election cycle. I think you plan for the long term because economic cycles are not short term. Okay. But you execute your policy in the mandated time, which is 5 years. Elections for me are a report card day. And that's how we hold our elected officials accountable. We are all a part of an organization. And if you're allowed to do what you want to do, how you want to do it, and there is no assessment of what you're doing, then you will continue to do what you want to do. And if it's not on the right track, then you will stay off the rails. So I think the planning should be for the long term. And I think political organizations, when they're in government, should not handicap or handcuff future generations by the policies that they make. They ought to think in terms of, if I'm not here, how can this be executed in such a way that will benefit the people of the Bahamas and the country? And I think that's what I feel sometimes is lost on our politicians. I feel like, they say it, but there's not a lot of, I believe, thought about the people of the country and the country itself. A lot of it is for what, our party can get. And I think that's why we are in the state that we are in right now. But your mandate is 5 years. If someone comes to me and say, Pam, I'm going to hire you for this particular time to get this work done, can you do it? And I say, yes, then I will be assessed at the end of that period. So go in there and plan for long term. but execute what you said you were going to execute in the mandated time that you were allocated to execute it in.
Mhm. Mhm. I agree with Pam. I don't think we should be shortening our planning horizon. We need to strengthen our framework. If we look at Singapore, for example, its growth wasn't dependent on changing political leadership. It was driven by durable institutions and long-term policy frameworks. So I think we probably need to, mimic and look at Singapore and probably mimic what they're doing and put long-term frameworks in place for the country.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, like Pam said, our economies don't reset every election cycle, and we have to get out of this habit of stopping, reviewing, and canceling. Because when we push things down the road, it gets more expensive. You see how everything went up after the COVID-19 pandemic, so everything is more expensive. We need to economic plans, even if the government changes, economic plans should not change. You have to put strategy in place to make sure that it's ongoing for future years and for future generations. Yes, short-term relief is important, especially given what is happening right now with the cost of living. But we also have to make persons buy into long-term plans and long-term goals. And I think that would be effective.
I want to go back to our poll. We asked, how do you typically evaluate the credibility of a campaign promise? And I'm happy that so many of you have answered this way. 69 say you research it yourself. And that's what we're here for. CFAL, we like to do a lot of research as well. Others have said that 50% say they rely on the experts. Like us, that's good. Media coverage is important as well, and discussions with others. I mean, all of these really are important because during this time, we're thinking about how our country is going to be ran for the next 5 years. And so we need to actually do all of those things. There's not one that's better than the other. But while I'm going to tell you guys the next question before I read the next answer to the poll, but things are ramping up. There's going to be rallies. I think the big ones every day. What are some economic red flags that voters should be alert to during these campaigns when they come out? What should make you pause and think, let me go home and let me Google that. And not always ChatGPT, because ChatGPT will sometimes give you the wrong information, but yeah. So while you guys think about that, I want to just get our attendees. I asked what factor most influences whether you believe a political promise, and 38% said a clear funding plan, which we've spoken about today. That's supported, but the highest went to past performance of the party. So Pam, you said that. You said election day is kind of like a report card for the incumbent government. So go ahead, tell me what you think the economic red flag should be when they start these rallies and they're on the stage saying anything.
How's that? These no-cost promises. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. Like it's free. Nothing is free in life. So I think you have to analyze that when it is no cost to you. Because like I mentioned, when government overspends, they're going to get their money back one way or the other. They're going to borrow. And if they borrow, that's more interest payment and that's less spending on the essentials, or if they're going to increase taxes. So be wary of it's free. You don't have to think about it. You can get it free. Yeah, there's always a cost. And I know sometimes we are so concerned about the instant gratification. That's life in general. We want it right now, and we don't care about down the road and the consequences down the road. But I think more of us need to be concerned about that because we are going to pay for it down the road if it's marketed as free right now.
I totally agree with Pam. A red flag for me is big promises with no clear funding because, everything has a cost, like Pam said. So it's going to show up, if not today, it's going to show up later in higher debt and higher taxes. Election economics isn't political, it's mathematical. And, like people like to say, the math need to make sense. It has to add up. It needs to math.
Yeah. One of the first concepts that I learned in economics, and it's always stuck with me, and the professor can back me up here, is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. So everything has a cost. So we need to know if we are not paying for these costs today, who is going to pay for them down the road?
Yeah, I think it's again, I reiterate, we know that the government is running a fiscal deficit. We know that our debt continues to grow. And you could kind of do a litmus test on all of these promises, right? If someone tells you X can be done for this amount of people, you can calculate. And if that costs 100 million, where can the Bahamas find $100 million, overnight, right? We're not going to strike oil tomorrow or anything significant. And the budget is largely set, right? A lot of the expenditure in the budget is salaries and interest payments and education and stuff. So the government has, a relatively small amount of flexibility in how quickly they can move things around. And so you just have to be realistic about what is being promised. If something is 2-3 million, yes, that can be done overnight. But when you get to 50, 60, 100 million, you really have to ask the question, how are you going to pay for this? And I think sometimes you ask them and see how they respond. They might tell you, we may
Access.
you ask things like NHI, if someone, and two, taxation isn't always bad, right? If someone says, we're going to improve healthcare, and they say, well, persons above a certain income will pay a NHI tax, say 1% or something, you could stomach that, right? You could understand it and say, you know what, my parents or my grandparents need to go to the hospital. I'm fine with that. So just ask them how they're going to pay, and tell them, be honest. If taxes go up, let me know now so I could have a good understanding.
That's important because we get these promises, and then after election day, when they make the budget presentation, that's when we are slapped with the bill,
Yeah.
So if you tell us up front, and if you level with Bahamian people, you say, hey, listen, you guys, healthcare is free. We need this much money to improve our health care system. Many Bahamians can understand that,
I want to add another one, vague promises.
Yeah.
Like we're going to build upon this, we're going to build upon that, we're going to expand this when they're not really specific but vague promises.
And 74% of the people polled said funding for campaign promises is essential. So we're all on the same page. We all know
Funding.
that you just can't tell us anything. It reminds me of a story where I may or may not have been involved. Yes, I want this improvement, this upgrade, yes, all of that,
And then when the price is quoted,
okay. So that's important. I want to let everyone viewing us today know that you can go ahead and you can start putting questions in. We've got about 10 minutes left with you guys, but we're not done yet. I want to just ask you, in addition to the red flags, what questions should voters be asking? Angelo, you said, ask them straight up. You say, we're going to, build these homes, or we're going to expand this this industry. How are we going to pay for this? What questions should you be asking your MP or the candidate running in your area when they knock on your door and ask for your votes?
Yeah, so for me, I want to know, because they, put out these promises out there. I want to know, what is the cost of failure? What is the cost if this promise doesn't come to fruition? Like, who is going to pay for it? Because you're putting this out there, you're saying that this is something that's necessary, but if it isn't done, or if we don't have the economic growth to pay for it, if we have another global shock, what is the cost of this not coming to fruition?
How about you, Anna?
Okay, I feel the right questions cut through slogans and force substance. So for me, I think every voter should ask, what does this policy cost and how will it be paid for? Again, we're going back to cost. How are these promises going to be funded? Because like we said, everything has a price. There's no such thing as free lunch.
Yeah.
So we need to know how is it going to be paid for?
When I think back over the election cycles, I think I have met one candidate that caught me home. Had a conversation. I've never had a conversation with a candidate. I've never came up to me and asked for their vote or anything like that. But if I were to meet a candidate, I would probably want to know if some of the policies that they are promoting, if it would make sense 5, 6, 7 years down the road. that they're not just doing it because they're trying to get elected, but this short-term policy has sustainability over the long term.
For me, would just ask them their ideologies and what do they actually believe, right? Because, for example, in the US, you have Democrats, Republicans, and they tend to have different beliefs. In the Bahamas, you have PLP, FNM that should have different beliefs. And, understanding what they believe in, because at the end of the day, their beliefs, they're supposed to go to Parliament and represent you, right? So when a policy comes up that, they don't disagree with, will they just vote on it or will they actually bring the concerns of the residents? And so getting an understanding of their political ideology and what they believe in, I think is important. Like you said, the short term, I can do this, I can fix your park thing. Those things are simple fixes, right? That should be done regardless. It's what you're going to do when you get in the policy chamber that ultimately affects me, my kids, my family, etc.
And Angelo said something that's very important. Normally what we have happening here is, whatever the policy the party pushes, everybody goes along with it, even if it's to the detriment of the Bahamian people. And that's why I said, I don't think a lot of times they think about the Bahamian people, right? What I would want to see is not necessarily disunity, but more persons challenging the leadership. That's what backbenchers are supposed to be for. Like if the executive comes with something or the senior in the party comes with something, but it's not going to be good overall, you want to see more challenging of that. But if everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet, and even if this policy is not going to be beneficial to us, I think that's a serious indictment on our political system.
Yeah. I guess for me, I always go to what's for the greater good of the people, and I like to hear that because I consider myself an idealist and I want everyone to have, like you say, equal opportunity, equal access to all of the benefits that being a Bahamian has. So I agree with all of you. So I'm going to now open the floor up to questions. We have some already that have come in that I'll get to in just a minute, but I want to remind everybody as you're putting your questions into the chat, as you're asking your questions, please be respectful. We want to have a fair and balanced discussion, and but we can all still have a little bit of fun with this. So the first question here is: I understand there's a lot of concern on the unemployment for younger people. There are, however, there's a growing population of older adults who are unemployed, underemployed, facing retirement in their 50s, equally shouldering the responsibilities of multi-generational homes. So what are your thoughts, the panelists, what are your thoughts on meeting the needs of this older population that may not have had as good of a start and they're finding themselves struggling and they need more resources and increasing dependency from the government?
Well, I think I taught at university and I always would see like older persons upskilling themselves and educating on themselves. And sometimes you speak to them and they say, I've been doing this so long, I want a career shift or I want better. And I think that's important because like you mentioned, certain persons, when they reach a certain age, it's almost like they become unemployable. Not that I believe they're unemployable, but the business sector, they want someone younger who's going to be, who may accept more. I don't know how to describe it, but who may let them get away with more, right? And so I think part of that, things like education is relatively free, things like University of the Bahamas, BTVI, so I would say continue to upskill yourself or look for ways that things like healthcare where there's, and you could target areas where there's so much work permits, right? Places like healthcare, education, there's endless amounts of work permits in those sectors where I think, you may have to do a career shift to try and position yourself for.
I agree with that. They're just, when it comes to labor, there's some areas there's no need for work permits for those jobs because we have sufficient people who can fill those positions. Did any of you want to answer before I move on to the
No,
next
I agree with
question?
the work permit. I think we need to really utilize as much of Bahamians as possible. And I think we need to, in the schools, have programs where where our kids can get the necessary training that they need. Don't wait until they leave high school to give them soft skills, like have programs in the schools where they can learn these skills. Like, for instance, we have a lot of foreigners that we bring in for technical stuff, like air conditioning technician and a lot of these areas, and the government has access to this information. So if you look and you see that we have to bring in a lot of foreigners for this area, then that means that you need to start with the schools to see how you can improve that. Even if you have to import lecturers who have the experience, so you can teach the kids while they are in school, so when they come out of school, they can get a job and not take the easy route. And maybe because you get income from work permit to continue to hire foreigners. I don't have a problem with importing labor in some cases, but I just believe if you continue to do that to the detriment of your citizen, you're going to have a problem. You're going to have social problems in the country. So more needs to be done. Use the information available to you in order to address a lot of the many issues that we are having.
I have a question specific to you.
Me?
Whenever you go to get your own talk show. On the hour. That's your second. That's the second. I'm tired from there. Okay, another question that's interesting. This one's about the public service. What does the panel think about reforming or reducing the public sector, and will doing so reduce the overall costs to the country? That's kind of one of our largest bills here.
Yeah, so salaries and emoluments are one of those things that we're locked into. So basically, that's also a high cost to government. I think that there can be more efficiencies in the the public sector, sorry, but we need economic growth and policy to bulk up the private sector so that they can absorb those people that would have otherwise been employed in the public sector. So it's okay to give people jobs in the public sector, but it becomes a burden on the government and ultimately a burden on the taxpayers because our taxes pay for those costs. But in the private sector, they need economic growth in order for them to make sufficient revenue so that they can hire more people. And Angelo also mentioned upskilling. We also need a better trained and a better informed workforce. So I do think that the public sector may be maybe too much people, but we can't just say, oh, you have to let go of all these people because who will absorb them? And I think that the government needs to make policies to ensure that the private sector is better able, whether it be through taxation relief. And I think you mentioned on the political promises, sort of making it easier for businesses to register. But we need some sort of economic growth so that the private sector can absorb these persons. Because right now, a lot of persons are complaining about the cost of doing business. And one of the highest expenses for businesses is salaries. Yeah.
Right. I agree with Rochelle. We always hear about the government giving concessions to foreign companies and investors, for projects, etc. I think the government should probably also extend concessions to the private sector, especially, for people. There's a lot of entrepreneurs who can start their own businesses and existing companies, who have that focus on the blue collar workers. Give those companies concessions so they can hire young people and train them. And so these young individuals, like you said, unemployment is so high, especially the youth, at 20%. So we need to give the private sector concessions and incentives to hire these young people because, my husband, he has a business and he basically but these companies have to put in the time and the money to train these young people, and so it's a cost to them up front. So, some sort of incentive and concession to help the companies, something. Yeah.
I think we should focus on two-page pension legislation. Because I think what happened in the public sector is sometimes people have been there for 30, 40 years, they're retired, and then they bring them back. And so the young people that are waiting in line never get their chance. They have to be waiting around for 30, 40 years before they could possibly get into the position. But if we have proper pension legislation, when persons have completed their work time, then they could retire comfortably. And if they want to work part-time, they can. You know, I have a friend who retired a few years ago, and she said she's enjoying her life. She's gardening, she has a pension, she's gardening, she's traveling, and she's just loving it. And she said she wouldn't come back to the workforce, even if it's just part-time, right? But then there's some people who don't mind doing that. But it shouldn't be a necessity. It shouldn't be an urgency in order for you to live. So I think that we really need to look at, and it should not be government managed. I don't want the government managing the pensions. I think private company with mandates should manage pensions so that when persons are done working, spend all that time in working, they can retire comfortably and live within their means and enjoy a life of retirement.
Angela, I think this is a good question for you. This person says national debt seems to be a necessary evil in country. Is it realistic to promise to reduce national debt?
I think it's difficult. I've not seen really many countries around the world actually reduce their national debt. You've seen some to the Caribbean do it, but you know, those were through IMF programs and possible defaults on their debt, which I think we want to avoid. But I think it would be good if we could, you know, perhaps balance the budget. And I think we need to balance the budget in normal years, right? Of course, when you have a hurricane and external shocks, you will have a deficit. But we keep running big deficits 5, 6, 7 years after these things happen, and then something else comes. So I think we should have some sort of strategy where, you know, 3 to 4 years after a crisis, we push to get back to a balanced budget, which could stop the accumulation of debt. But, you know, if your economy is growing at 3, 4% and your debt is growing at, say, 0.5%, then something like that is sustainable. Again, I think the government's plan is to reduce the debt to GDP ratio by increasing the GDP more so than actually reducing the debt, right? And that is good as well. But at the same time, that has to translate into revenue, right? You can't have a $14 billion economy, your revenue is 3 billion, and then you tell me the economy is 28 billion and your revenue is still 3 billion, right? Because we're not really benefiting in that sense. So if it's a reduction via growth in GDP, and that translates into revenue, which means you don't have to tax Bahamians, then I think that's a sustainable way to do it.
Speaking of revenues, this question simply asks, what are your thoughts on a national lottery? Right there. Any takers?
Any takers?
Well, I do think that a national lottery may be beneficial in terms of raising taxes for the government. And these can be targeted lotteries. So you can say the money that I earn from this lottery is going to go in education. It's going to go in healthcare. It should not go into the black hole that is called the consolidated fund. I think that if we do it right, and we are fond of hiring consultants, so I think that we can get consultants if we do it right. We see in terms of the US, and we see they have state lotteries, and they use the state uses the earnings from these lotteries to fund various programs. So I think that we can do it, if we do it properly, we can do it right, but it has to be something that is targeted. It can't just be something, I'm going to take this revenues or these earnings and just, put it anywhere. I need to know, like, this is going to fund education. This is going to fund scholarships.
Well, I voted against the gaming referendum. But the government went ahead and legalized it anyways, right? So if that's the case and successive administrations have kept it, I think that the country should benefit as much as possible from it. I don't think it should be just a select group of persons. And it's much needed because you see a few weeks ago, we had the argument with Carifta. The kids are going and representing the Bahamas and they don't have the necessary funding. Parents have to put their hands in their pocket to pay for kids who are representing the Bahamas. And so if you had something that's managed, the people want to gamble. And so if you had something where it's properly managed, again, not government, we don't want government managing it. We want to make sure there's private managers, and then government ensure that the legislation is being carried out as it relates to these companies. And then you allocate monies towards very important programs that are needed. Because I feel like if we could help our young people, if we could help them in sports and other areas, it's going to be so much beneficial to our country. So if this is what the government wanted to do, again, remember I talked about looking out for the best interests of the Bahamian people. But seeing as how you wanted to do it, even though the people said no, then I think most of that money should be used to go back into the economy, particularly dealing with our youth development. That's my view.
A lot of questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. One question I can easily answer: how can professionals like you guys help to positively influence national policy and political accountability? And I think this forum that we're having right now is the first step. You know, we are very actively engaged in commenting on national issues via our insights, our blogs, our weekly column. We're always available to speak, and the hope is that government officials, politicians are listening, because we feel like we're a voice for you. Pam, you mentioned this a little earlier, but you can, if you want to elaborate, how can the incoming government address the current pension crisis? We did speak to that because a lot of people are retiring with little to no saving, and national insurance pays very little in retirement. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I just think that there needs to be serious consideration for that, having a pension, so that everybody who works, when they retire, they have something to look forward to. And then government wouldn't have to worry about rehiring people. Allow persons to retire when they reach that age. And if they want to work on the side part-time somewhere, fine, do so, but not keeping other people or younger people back from positions that I think that they can excel in.
And I think to that point, the unfortunate reality is, when these things, for a long time, we kicked the can on the road, and at some point you reach the end of the road, and it's you see benefits cut, and the retirement age is extended, right? So again, short-term decisions, not properly addressing things like NIB, always come back to bite us long term. And if they refuse to deal with it, at some point we the citizens will see the effects of it.
Well, can I comment? Actually, that's a very good question. And we just had this conversation over dinner last night about pension. So my husband was asking, he's saying, we should probably do this. I'm like, yeah, it'll be a good idea. Instead of giving salary increases and you're young, because he has a lot of young men working for him, and I have two young men, and I force them. I have a system in place, and I force them to save, right? And so my youngest was asking, like, what is a pension? How is this going to benefit me? So I had to basically explain, to my husband, the types of pension plans, whether it's voluntary, involuntary. The employer would decide that. And then as an employee, what my son was like, what would that do for me? So I had to explain it to him. And I'm like, okay, it's a forced savings that you're going to have aside. So when you reach retirement, you have something, so when you commit that 1% or whatever it is you're committing from your salary, sometimes life happens and you may not have the ability to save on a consistent basis or, weekly, monthly, but at least know that in those times when you can't save, have a discretionary saving, that something is going aside for you. So you're saving without actually feeling it. So
my very first investment, they were taking out pension. I didn't even realize it. And my very first investment, I was able, because we don't have pension legislation, to tap into my pension account, brought down $20,000 to aid me with that investment. So it's a benefit. And if we have pension legislation, I would not be able to do that. But because the funds were being taken out, I didn't even know. Yeah. When I found out, then
whoa.
To add to that page, I basically explained CFAL, how CFAL's pension work to Nathaniel. So he was like, oh, well, that's free money.
money,
Yeah. When we're talking politics, it's important that we are here to help you secure your future, your financial future. And
that's policy page.
Yeah.
That's policy.
Yeah.
And that's what politicians are supposed to be discussing.
This is a question kind of unrelated, but with the rise of AI business, one of the campaign promises is AI regulation. We see a significant loss of jobs in the next few years. I don't personally feel so. There's a human component to a lot of these jobs that just cannot be replaced with AI. But would any of you like to tackle that?
Yeah, I agree. There is a human component. There's a human touch that can't be replaced. I think I read a story where one newspaper in the US, they had basically not hired, but they are basically using AI to like take photos, and then the pictures were like so dull because it didn't have that human touch. It didn't have that person there who could catch the eye and catch the lighting. So they were like basically generic. I think that AI is meant to improve efficiencies, but I don't think that it's going to take over our jobs over the next 5 or 10 years. I hope I am right, because I did see a video of a robot chasing some wild boar. So I'm like, whoa. Like, what is this? But that goes back to what Angela had mentioned earlier about upskilling and learning and making sure that you're moving ahead. And you're and these things, like, it's not expensive to do this. Like, you could take courses online for free or for a marginal amount of money. So I think that it's important for us not just to sit back on our laurels and be like, oh, whoa, AI is coming for my jobs. But you're just sitting there, like, what are you doing to upskill yourself?
Okay. Sorry, there's a funny video. I don't know if anyone's seen it. There's like a mother doing household chores, doing the laundry and picking up after her kids. And she's like, okay, she's waiting on AI.
Yes. What we even cook.
I'm gonna just do some more questions because we have a lot, and I'm so sorry we can't get to all of them. But this one, I'm gonna try to fold two questions into one. If tourism should die globally tomorrow, and we've seen this happen with the COVID-19 pandemic, what would you recommend from an economic standpoint in the way that we transition, or what industry, this is the part of the other section, do you think would put us in a better position to withstand that kind of shock? What are your thoughts?
I think the reality is, right, you look around the world, there's not a lot of industries, if we're being honest, right? Tourism is probably the largest industry in the world. I know we think of the Bahamas as just a tourism hub, but every country around the world, tourism is a significant percentage of their GDP, right? And any shutdown, I think, in tourism is, well, for the most part, temporary, unless, there's some World War III or something like that. And there's other things such as manufacturing. With our cost basis, is not the most realistic. There's things like oil production, which we don't have and we don't plan to do. So I think, however, to the question, if tourism shuts down, we'll have to go back to farming. The reality is we'll have to feed ourselves. There's no industry overnight that you can just come up with. And I think, again, we always look at tourism as such a negative thing and us being so dependent. But if you look at every country around the world, Canada, the US, Spain, Germany, all of those countries, even the Middle Eastern countries with oil, they are pushing tourism, right? So tourism is the largest industry in the world. People want to go places and explore. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it will always be the primary driver of our economy. But we could look at things like, increasing our independence, right? Reducing our dependence on fossil fuels to things like solar energy, things like the Golden Yolk program, for example, right? Producing our own eggs. I always said we should be growing lumber. We have so much empty land on the Family Islands. We should plant trees. Hurricane come, it does nothing to, the bark of the tree, right? Things that we know we'll need for plywood. And so we'll have to get back to those basics to survive. But I think that's an end of the world scenario.
And I agree with Angelo. And I think one of the issues in our tourism sector is we don't feel the real benefit because of all the concessions and the focus on the jobs, but not really ensuring that we get the requisite revenue from this industry. That's why it just feels such a strain on Bahamians. And adding to Angelo's point, also energy reform, where we are actually getting affordable and reliable energy. And we don't want affordable and reliable energy to the expense of BPL. Because if BPL is losing money to provide affordable and reliable energy, then we still have to pay it back in taxes as the government has to subsidize the company. But real affordable energy where we're using solar, and you find that that's a spin-off, because if we could get really reasonable energy, then a lot of businesses would have more profits. Even, tourism will make sense. Manufacturing maybe will make sense, small scale manufacturing. But yeah, I think we have to look at these concessions that we so quickly offer, but from the growth numbers over the years, we're not seeing the results.
I think for me, we probably could look at the online space. We have a lot of creative Bahamians, So I've heard and in the news lately, content creators trying to get monetized. So I think if that space, if it can be easier for Bahamians to promote, their talents, sell online and be able to make funds like that. People watch all sorts of videos. I mean, they watch adults playing with toys. And it's like the craziest things out there. And we have so much talent. So if we're able to take that talent and for me personally, I like to dabble in oil painting. So I, make prints, sell these things online. My husband and sons, they're renovating or restoring a boat, and they decided to just record it. And they're putting the videos on YouTube. They have a couple hundred viewers. So when they hit 1,000, does YouTube start paying? How will they get this money? So that's something they have to think about if it ever gets there. But we have a lot of talented Bahamians, and I think the online space is definitely something that people can look at as an option.
And like I said, we'll do this final question. What are your suggestions? And maybe you guys can each speak to this to fund these government promises. We've been talking about the promises the governments have made. What are your suggestions on how we can fund them and how we can move beyond relying so much on the government to make these promises and be self-sufficient, so that as Bahamians, it's not impressive to us anymore if somebody dangles a TV in the front of us and say, hey, vote for me, you got a free TV or a new car, or I'm feeding you chicken at a rally. What are your thoughts?
I think that when you have to ask the question, how is this going to benefit us over the long term, and what things do we have to do? Because I think we have a small open economy. So I think that we need to be focused on the things that we can do, like Pam mentioned, that matter for us, so that what's best for us in the long term. And, Mel could say anything, but as we all alluded to, a promise is not a policy until it's funded, until we have things like, how can we pay for this? So we need to diversify the economy, but tourism is our bread and butter. But we have to, I don't know, we don't like taxes, but taxes can be beneficial and they're important to running an efficient economy. But I think that these things have to make sense, and these things have to be well planned out, and they have to be well explained to the average citizen.
I feel like we have to really manage our spending. Yes, there are essential stuff, but a lot of stuff that we are spending on as a government, no, it's not necessary. We could do it. So manage our spending, try to bring costs down so that the economy can grow. And I have no problems with public-private partnerships, because if you notice over the last 10, 15 years, the government hasn't really done any major infrastructure investment. They've relied a lot on public-private partnership, but I think the public-private partnerships need to make sense. I do not agree with a public-private partnership when the government has to give in money for the private side to make money. No, I believe in real public-private partnerships where you're supporting the government and the government also benefits from that arrangement. And I've always used it, the Nassau Cruise Port. I mean, that's a public-private partnership and the government gets at minimum. I mean, I'm not even talking about the VAT and stuff from on the port, but the government gets at minimum. We had about 10+ million tourists last year. They get $23 per head. So that's about 200 and something million dollars the government get with that public-private partnership. That to me should be the model of public-private partnerships. The government has to make money in these arrangements.
Okay. For me, budget is very important. So I look at the government like my household. I make X amount, my husband make X amount, our bills are X amount. So you have to plan and you have to budget, you have to save. You know, you might, like my husband like to say, you need to spend some, you need to save some, and you need to give some. So, you know, our government need to do the same thing. And sometimes life happens, you know, you have unexpected bills, you know, things can happen and you can, you know, get out, your budget goes out of whack, but you have to adjust. You have to adjust and you have to refocus and do what you say. If this money is for X, you need to do X with that money. You can't take your mortgage payment and go on vacation because then the bank is going to come knocking at your door and you have nowhere to go. So I think, you know, our governments expect us to be good, fiscal, responsible individuals. So they also need to be, you know, fiscally responsible as well.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a lot of reallocation can happen. If you read the newspaper over the last couple of days, you'll see a lot of money spent, right? You know, things like travel, right? When you hear the amount of money that's spent on travel, consultants, you know, beaches and parks, like you could build a hospital in 5 years, right? So, you know, maybe you don't, I understand there's emergency travel and things like that, but if we are serious, we can cut back on some things. I do think we need to cut back because the way we operate, we say this would be spending, and then we can figure the revenue out. And that's why we've been running these deficits. The expenditure line item is set. What you get in revenue depends, right? If something happens, the tourists may not come as much as you thought, or, you know, if oil prices go up, you may. So we have this plan where we just spend and we hope the revenue matches. We find out.
Think about it
You know,
later.
September after the budget year ends, and that's just not a way to operate. I think we really need to slow down and look at how the economy is functioning. I think we're full speed ahead, you know, with an economy that's not really working for Bahamians, right? We have so much work permits and immigration, and why build an economy that you have to then bring in someone to work, which drives up the price of housing and takes away opportunities from Bahamians, right? And that takes maybe a 10-year approach, but you know, they're thinking 3-4 years. So I just need to get this hotel built. I need to do this, and so we're just all over the place with no plan.
Well, I just want to thank everybody. We're gonna end there because there are lots more questions and we can't get to all of them. We do have to get back to work. But I want to thank all of you for joining us today. This was really a really fun and lively discussion, and I hope that you got something out of it, a better understanding of how to approach the topics at hand and what's being promised to you. We ask that if you have any questions that we weren't able to answer, please email us at info@cfal.com. We're happy to respond to that and speak with you one-on-one. We hope you had a great time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a wrap.